Chapter 14. The nights were still chilly, and Rika wore her trench coat out in the evening, but the days were warm enough that she'd be sweating even in a light jumper. Rika now weighed 59 kilos, 10 kilos heavier than when she'd first started covering the Kajii case. Now that there was no chance of her appearing slim however hard she tried, she had resolved to wear whatever she wanted. Today, she wore a jumper of an acid green shade like apple sherbet, which she'd bought in a sale, but always thought too girly for her, complete with a brooch that her mother had given her. She was still perpetually short of sleep, but her hair and skin looked more lustrous. Was that the result of a better diet? Now, looking out the window, her estate agent said, "It's the perfect spot for a hanami picnic. You've got shops selling nice ready-made food in the arcade nearby, so you wouldn't even need to prepare." A constant stream of pale petals from the cherry trees in full bloom outside the window floated down onto the puddles on the ground, blanketing them. In the end, the cherry trees had bloomed later than expected, so the hanami parties with work people that had been arranged for the end of March hadn't been the liveliest of affairs. For a time, the two women said nothing, gazing down together at the park below. Encircled by the cherry trees sat several groups of mothers and children on small picnic sheets spread with grilled chicken and bento boxes. The property Rika was viewing was a 3-bedroomed apartment with a large open-plan kitchen, built some 30 years earlier. It was a fair walk from the nearest station, but it was of a price that meant Rika would feasibly be able to eventually pay off her mortgage, even if she took early retirement. If Rika's ideas about getting her own place were starting to assume a tinge of reality, it had a lot to do with her estate agent, Hatoko Yamamura, sister of Tokio Yamamura. The information Kitamura had provided about Kajii's victim's sister had led Rika to an estate agency in Nishi-Shinjuku. In the third-floor office of a tall, narrow building with a water cooler that gurgled loudly placed in the entrance, she'd asked for Hatoko Yamamura. As she was explaining to the young male employee that she was a single woman looking for a property with as many rooms as possible, and that she'd heard Hatoko was great to work with, the woman herself had poked her head round a door at the back of the office. With hot water from the dispenser, she'd made them weak matcha tea. From that point on, they'd been meeting once every 4 or so days, when Rika found space in her working schedule. Today was their third appointment. Rika had given her real name and profession, but Hatoko showed no sign of suspicion. Perhaps she could tell that Rika was truly interested in the properties and wasn't pretending. Attempting not to lose track of her real objective in all of this, Rika would sneak looks at the side of Hatoko's face, trying to imagine what it must be like to have a member of your family stolen away permanently by a woman like Kajii. It's amazing that you manage to cook properly when you're so busy with work. At Hatoko's comment, which seemed to come from genuine admiration rather than a wish to flatter, Rika snapped back to herself. Without fully knowing what she was doing, she'd gone back into the kitchen and was opening and closing the oven door. Hatoko looked at her from where she stood in the living room. The sunlight pouring in through the window illuminated the downy hairs around her mouth. "Oh no, I've just started learning. But I do think it'd be great to have a proper oven like this. If possible, I'd love a hob with at least 3 rings." Just through interacting with Hatoko, Rika could feel her wishes assuming a more visible form. At first, Hatoko had come over as a little frosty, but Rika was starting to understand that her way of working consisted in listening carefully to what the other person said and not butting in too much, so as to best ascertain their needs. "Are you going to cookery classes?" "I find them so," Hatoko began, and then shook her head, saying, "Ignore me." When Rika encouraged her, she said hesitantly, "I suppose they're attended by very domestically minded women, with lots of time and money on their hands." She didn't sound subservient, but there was a hint of resignation to her words. Was she thinking of Kajii as she spoke? Rika found herself attempting to smooth things over. "I'm not remotely domestic myself, I just like eating. I'm happiest when I'm cooking for myself." Hatoko began talking at speed, as if to justify herself. "I don't cook. I'm bad at it. Since my mother died, I don't even set foot in the kitchen. My mother wasn't that fond of cooking either, so when I see someone using an oven, I think, wow. I feel a sense of inferiority, I suppose. Despite the personal nature of what she was saying, Hatoko's expression didn't change as she spoke. The roughness of her skin made her black hair appear glossy, almost wet, in contrast. Her eyes were set closely together, as were her nose and her mouth. Her thick, unkempt eyebrows cast dark shadows over her eyelids. She didn't look very like her baby-faced brother, Kajii's victim, who seemed to be pouting in every photo taken of him. Rika had heard that the mother had been overprotective of her son, but what had her relationship been like with her daughter, his older sister? Rika got the sense that Hatoko may have been very capable from a young age, the kind who thought nothing of taking care of herself. Rika attempted to change the subject. I'd like to have as many rooms as possible. It doesn't matter if they're small. When my grandfather dies, my mother might want to come and live with me. I'd like to make the place into a kind of refuge that people around me can use. A refuge. Yes, a lot of my friends, both male and female, get quite lonely. Sorry, I know that's quite a particular ask. But that's the main reason I want to buy a place of my own. Rika was surprised to hear herself referring to Shinoi as a friend, and yet it felt right. Of late, they hadn't been talking about news items, and all his tip-offs had been going to Kitamura. One day I might need to rely on them, so I want to help them out while I still can. When I was in middle school, I found my father's body in the apartment where he was living by himself, and I can't shake off the feeling that I'm going to die alone as well. He died alone? Hatoko murmured, then fell silent. Rika knew that she had abandoned her former career as a result of what happened to her brother. Rika wondered whether she'd be able to carry on working at Shimaisha in the long term. Thanks to the Kajii feature, her path to the editorial desk had come into sharper focus. But when she thought about whether she'd have the physical and mental strength to continue doing that job into her 40s and 50s, she wondered whether she'd be able to keep up mortgage repayments for a place of her own. She'd decided that when she came to the end of the Kajii feature, she would need to take stock of what was possible for her at 33. I started thinking about those things too, when I was your age. Hatoko tilted her oval face. There was something hard and stiff about her aura, and she didn't smile readily. But the more Rika saw her, the more she caught glimpses of a different side to her, the sassy movement of her eyes when explaining the plumbing system, or the way she would go after the landlord with an unfazed expression when something in a property wasn't quite working as it should. Now she was gazing at a young boy and slightly older-looking girl playing in the park below. I live on my own, and I don't anticipate that ever changing. I'm really glad that I bought a place of my own around 40. It meant I was able to start using the time I'd spent worrying about it doing other things I enjoy. Hatoko's tone was light, but it was the first time that she'd spoken in this much depth about her own life. The best thing to do, Rika thought, would be to conceal the fact that this had all been part of her research and slip away quietly from Hatoko's life. I've understood what it is you're looking for, she said now. Rather than a sealed-off space, you want a place where people can come and go, and where you can customize things. An inviting space that can be a point of intersection for lots of different people. A space to rest and rejuvenate. A gust of wind blew in from the window. Several cherry petals clung to the mosquito netting, trembling for a few moments before falling lightly to the ground. So it's okay to think about it in that way? Rika said. Hatoko made to close the window as she replied. As long as somewhere has got a roof and a place to let the air in, then it's good as a home. I think a place's inhabitants should be free to decide how it's going to be used. When people are bound by rules, they find it difficult to choose a property that suits them. I'll have a think about what might work best for you. Even among properties of the same sort of area, the layout and the direction in which it faces can make a big difference to the feel of a place. Rika was doing the cooking lessons and the house hunting for entirely professional reasons, yet both had somehow come to soak through into her life. It was just like how, as you went on folding the dough for pie crust, the lumps of butter would all of a sudden cease to be visible. It's the first sellout issue in ages. When Rika arrived at work, the desk editor's ears and noses were flushed with excitement. The issue of the Shumi Weekly with the Manako Kajii interview as its lead article was making waves. They had received more letters and emails from readers than ever before. It had been talked about online before its publication, and even women in their 20s who would not usually go near the Shumi Weekly were buying it. The first part of the 6-part feature focused on Manako Kajii's life in Niigata. Kajii had been very reluctant to admit to any connection with the man who'd molested her sister, but when Rika happened to mention that he'd taken his life, her attitude had grown more compliant. He protected me. He fed me, enveloped me, and helped me, like a mother should. We were similar, and we only had one another. You could say that we had a physical relationship, and you could also say we didn't. Her manner of speech was as overblown as ever, but in essence amounted to a roundabout confession. When confronted with how, in her testimony in court, she'd morphed this man into a salesman from Tokyo, Kajii pinned her large, grape-like eyes on Rika and said in a clipped tone, "He was always vague in what he told me, always mixing reality and fantasy. To a young girl like me, he seemed like a sophisticated adult." Now, Rika passed her eyes over some of the emails sent in by readers that a temp had printed out for her. Why does the world get this worked up about Manako Kajii? Rika turned around to see Kitamura standing next to her, shaking his head. He had sleep in his eyes and his hair looked still rumpled, a far cry from his usual appearance. Thanks to one of Shinoi's tip-offs, he had a scoop in this same issue. The illegal dumping of waste by a care home run by a certain izakaya chain was the second biggest article, after the exclusive Kajii interview. I think everyone's starved of calorific substances. They're super responsive to anything with a whiff of crunch or excess about it. Kitamura looked unimpressed by this answer. Rika felt that he wouldn't understand even if she were to explain, so she ignored him and returned her eyes to the emails. She passed her eyes across the criticism that she had known would also come. However conceited it might sound, she sensed that the article's success wasn't solely down to the fascination with Kajii as a subject. It was because she'd put in the time and stuck with it until she was satisfied. Even if that didn't mean much to other people, she planned to keep on working like that in the future, honing her own unique style. Would that be possible at the Shumi Weekly? The temp came to tell her that the editor wanted to see her. When she entered the glass-fronted cubicle, the first words he said were not any words of praise or gratitude, but, "Can you increase the number of parts?" "No, I don't want to water it down. It'll be a 6-parter, as agreed." The editor raised his eyebrows, startled. It was the first time that Rika had ever pushed back on an order from above. "That's amazing, Kazuko." "You mean you practice everything we learn here at home?" a red-faced Chizu asked as she mixed the hollandaise sauce. She appeared to be struggling to get it to the state of thick and gloopy, with minuscule bubbles, as per Madam's instructions. The yellow liquid had been splashing around in the bowl for some time now, sending spray flying. "I don't manage to get everything right by a long stretch. But I just move on to the next thing without worrying too much," Rika replied as she cut off the hard bits at the base of the white asparagus spears. The chicken roasting in the oven was giving off a delicious aroma. Rika wanted to do everything the way Kajii had done it. In these 2 weeks, at home she had made all 4 of the dishes they'd learned to cook in their second lesson. Once every 3 or so days, she would go over to Shinoi's apartment relatively early in the evening and try her hand at one of the recipes. She attempted to reproduce them faithfully the way she'd been taught, without changing too much. The recipes given out in class all served 6 people, but she found that if she made them at Shinoi's, where there was always somebody staying over, it would all get polished off. Admittedly, the lamb with orange that she'd made first of all had been underdone, the volume of soup du poisson she'd produced had been very small, and the crepe Suzette had fallen to pieces. Yet even when she messed things up, she didn't stop, didn't permit herself to be disheartened, but simply moved on to the next thing. The previous evening, when she'd carried the sea urchin with beurre blanc sauce over to the dining table, the others had cheered in a way they'd not done before. Was it because this was her favorite of all the dishes they'd made in class so far that it had turned out so well? She'd also splashed out and bought herself a new apron. Now, overhearing her and Chizu's conversation, the other students began to chip in. "That's so good of you to do that. I almost never make the stuff I learn here at home." "Yes, I'm definitely absorbing techniques and knowledge, and I've made some dishes several times, but never all of them." I mean, even if I did rustle up French cuisine for my husband and kids, I'm not sure what they'd make of it. At this comment from Aki, everyone tittered in embarrassment. One day, one day, when the time comes, I'll do it. I just haven't given it my all yet, Shizu exclaimed in a high voice. Her hand holding the whisk finally stopped moving and she slumped against the table as if exhausted. Everyone burst out laughing. Madame smiled knowingly and dropped the white asparagus spears into the boiling water. You should all take a leaf from Kazuko's book. Practicing something immediately after you've learned it is the best way to master it. Asparagus is all about fragrance, so be careful not to overboil them. Rika now whispered into the ear next to her, which was pink with excitement. You know the turkey you told me about last time. What recipe were you going to follow? I couldn't find any in my French cooking book. Chizu shook her head from side to side, perhaps trying to dislodge some of the hair that was stuck with sweat to her neck, and replied hesitantly, I guess Madame would remember. Rika snuck a glance at Madame, who was lending a hand whisking the meringue. She waited until the lecture had finished, and the students were getting ready to go home, then asked her in as gentle a way as she knew how. The instant Rika pronounced the word turkey, she saw Madame's shoulders tense up, but her reply was as composed as ever. I've got a friend from university who's been living in the States for a while, with her husband's work. She had a real struggle at first, adapting the meals over there so they'd agree with her family's taste buds and making Japanese food from things she could get her hands on when Asian ingredients were less readily accessible. I was thinking of making it according to a recipe she gave me. I've only made it once myself. I had it in a notebook, which I took out and showed to everyone. I think that was when. Madame frowned slightly. Before she had time to suspect anything, Rika said quickly, would you mind if I copied that recipe? Yes, that's fine. It's so long you won't be able to copy it out now, so I'll lend you my recipe book, if you like. You can give it back whenever. Leaving Rika no time to demur, Madame went over to the bookcase on the wall. The notepad that Madame held out to her was covered in brown oil stains. Magazine clippings of recipes for simmered vegetables and Chinese dishes had been stuck into its pages, with handwritten notes in the margins. Seeing how unthinkingly Madame had shared this part of herself, a sense of guilt dug into Rika's tenderest part. Rika remembered Reiko's advice on approaching Kajii. To ask a woman who loves to cook for a recipe is to strike them in their weakest, most unprotected spot. In other words, all this time, Rika had been playing the dirtiest game imaginable. Thinking to herself that someday, eventually, she would get her comeuppance, Rika slid the notebook into her bag. Rika had initially been imagining cooking the turkey as an extension of her research, but she soon gave up on the idea. According to Madame's notes, a 5-kilogram turkey took 3 whole days just to defrost. Once it was defrosted, you had to prepare it, leave it overnight, and then roast it for 3 hours, keeping watch over it all the while. The following day you boiled the bones to make stock and could make sandwiches and gratins with the remaining meat. A 5-day-long task wasn't something that she could easily perform alongside her professional duties. The bird's hollowed-out insides were stuffed with its other parts, such as its gizzard, heart, liver, neck, and even, sometimes, its head. Imagine being killed, Rika thought, having your insides scooped out and then being stuffed with your own internal organs, your own head. The thought robbed her of her appetite, yet the description of the stuffing made of giblets, chestnuts, pine nuts, and mochi rice made her salivate. The description of how you would boil the turkey's neck to make gravy, something she so often read about in novels from overseas, gave her a rush of excitement. For once, Shinoi's apartment was deserted. Rika shut her laptop and headed to the kitchen. She took out eggs, butter, and white asparagus. She wanted to practice making the recipe from the lesson the day before she forgot how to do it. It was already past 2 in the morning, and she wanted to make sure she was in bed within the next hour. She'd sleep for 4 hours, then she had to go and see a government minister in Kasumigaseki. She melted the butter in the pan. She warmed the egg yolks by immersing them in a bowl of hot water and mixing them with vinegar, then pouring in the shining golden butter little by little. She moved the whisk ceaselessly, making the contents of the bowl whirl round and round. Having observed Chizu's troubles up close and learned how to avoid them, she succeeded in producing the fine egg-colored foam relatively quickly. Her whole hand, from the wrist down, was dancing a waltz. The tigers in the book, whose desires had kept them spinning round and round until they transformed into butter, had ended up in the stomachs of little Babaji's family. Even after their deaths, Kajii's victims continued to be exposed to and consumed by the curious gaze of the general public. Rika had stopped believing that any blame lay with the victims themselves. Being sucked into the vortex of Kajii's ominous power, like she herself had been, was something that could happen to anybody. Thinking this, she went on single-mindedly whisking the butter. Through her adventures with the Cotter quartz on Valentine's Day, she'd learned that waiting on the far side of all of this seemingly endless whisking was not stasis or evaporation, but emulsification. If she couldn't tear her eyes away from Kajii, if she couldn't stop herself from spinning round and round, then maybe all that was left to do was to grip onto Kajii with all her might, so as to ensure she wasn't shaken off. Done, Rika said to herself and lifted up the whisk. The sauce of warm, bright yellow that came dripping off the whisk was smooth as cashmere. Rika heard the door open, and then Shinoi's voice, apparently having seen the number of shoes, saying, "Is nobody around today?" Soon after, she heard the sound of him gargling loudly in the bathroom. "You said a welcome party for the new recruits, and Kitamura's chasing up your latest tip-off, so I'm on duty tonight. Though it seems as if Reiko's out. I don't know where she's gone, but I guess she might be having dinner with Ryosuke." Shinoi said, finally appearing in the room and draping his suit jacket over a hanger. Of late, he smelled less strongly of cigarette smoke. "Try this, if you'd like. It's white asparagus in a hollandaise sauce." Rika carried over to the table a plate laid out as beautifully as an artwork, together with a low-carb beer. Sitting down, Shinoi thanked her and took a long gulp of the beer. He let out a contented sigh and gently skewered a spear of asparagus with his fork. He lifted it straight to his mouth and chewed vigorously, his throat moving up and down. "This is great. It tastes of spring." Clearly embarrassed by what he'd just said, Shinoi laughed, avoiding Rika's eyes. "This might sound rude, but I think your cooking has really improved. Until now, the things you've made tasted like you'd cooked them well according to the recipe, but this one somehow has a Rika sort of flavor." "What kind of a flavor is that?" "Strong and assertive, but delicate at the same time. The kind of taste you don't get bored of." I actually amended the recipe this time. I felt like I wanted a tiny bit of natural sweetness, so I added a drop of honey. "Honey, eh?" Shinoi said, nodding, and reached out with his fork for another spear. Under Kajii's influence, I was eating lots of very heavy, orthodox dishes, but recently I've started to understand my own tastes better. I like relatively classical flavoring but with an extra something to pep it up, a bit of spice, or something to give a hint of acidity or bitterness. I also really like simple recipes with not too many flavors. Sounds like you're finding your own style. Speaking of which, the article is great. You present her viewpoint and way of thinking just as they are, while also managing to touch upon the background that gave rise to all of this. It's genuinely fascinating and has got its own flavor to it that stays with the reader. I guess that's your style, too. Feeling embarrassed, she glanced at him to check his expression. "Reiko's way better at cooking than I am." "Is she?" he said, covering his asparagus spear with lashings of sauce. "Reiko's face softens a little when she's talking with you. I enjoy her company too. She looks so serious, but she's a real oddball and fun to be around. We never run out of things to say to each other." I feel like I learn new perspectives on things from her, which is odd when she herself seems to operate with such tunnel vision. The two of them laughed, and Rika suddenly understood what it was that had drawn her to Shinoi. She felt she could trust him because they liked the same things. Right. She's got such a narrow focus, and yet you feel your world opening up through being with her. All of a sudden, Rika felt herself tearing up. All this time, she had been waiting for the moment when she could share everything she liked about her friend with someone else. She'd often worried whether anyone apart from her would notice the good points about her friend, which weren't immediately obvious, if anyone else would cherish them like she did. You could say that Ryosuke's way of loving the shiny, cheerful, good parts of Reiko and failing to notice any of her darkness was just his own way of loving her, but you could also argue that it was exactly that which had driven Reiko into a corner. Rika had always wanted to joke around with someone else about her best friend's reckless tendencies, her self-righteousness, her painful seriousness. I still don't feel I've got my head around marriage, but I'm sure it must be easier when you've got an escape. I don't mean infidelity, obviously. I mean a place that you can go to drink a cup of coffee when you feel stuck. Then your husband could come and collect you. I feel like that alone would be enough. Just because your family doesn't mean you have to share absolutely everything. That's heartening to hear. I've been thinking recently that I'm going to try and see my daughter. Shinoi's voice wavered slightly as he spoke. One of the conditions of our divorce is that I'm allowed to see her. But I asked to meet her once and she said no, and it hurt me so much that I haven't tried again. I just hear about her through my ex-wife. I don't have any intention of trying to be a model father to her like I did back then. I just want to aim to be a person she can have a cup of coffee with when she feels like it. Eating here with all you lot, I feel like I've understood a bit better what spending time with other people is about. As Rika nodded, it struck her that in the not-so-distant future, their little group would disband. Everyone was already beginning to return to their former routines. Shinoi needed to sell this apartment. They needed to move on. That seemed sad, but something new awaited all of them. She stood up and headed into the kitchen, then turned on the hob. Watching the large bubbles forming and then vanishing on the surface of the water in the pan, she felt Kajii's reason for objecting so strongly to the turkey taking clear shape in her mind. Caught up in the torrents of boiling water, the asparagus spears were being thrown violently up and down. If you want seconds, they'll just take a moment. She must have looked as though she were away with the fairies. Shinoi stared at her, saying nothing. The second round of asparagus, which she overcooked, was as fluffy and elusive as a spring breeze. People must have so much time on their hands. Are they really that obsessed with me? Kajii said. She affected irritation, but her eyes were sparkling with glee. This person simply adores attention, Rika thought. When she told Kajii that the edition featuring her interview had sold out, Kajii became as high-spirited as a child and brandished her own copy of the magazine, apparently acquired at the detention house shop. But instead of turning immediately to the interview, as Rika expected her to, Kajii opened it onto a double-page color spread featuring a young actress. Screwing up her face, she said bitterly, so cheap of her to do something like this. She must be losing favor. The 20-year-old actress was wearing a white sleeveless dress, her bright eyes open wide in an expression that said how impressed she was by all she saw and heard. She's forever looking at women, Rika thought. The image of a plump young girl licking ice cream as she stared fixedly at the female cows rose before Rika's eyes. I came today to talk to you about something else. I heard that, at Le Salon de Mayuko, you stormed out after taking objection to the students' plan to cook a turkey. I've finally understood why it is that the idea was so abhorrent to you. Kajii looked at her. There was an uncertainty in her. It seems like you were the only one of the students who'd always practiced the meals you'd been taught at Le Salon de Mayuko until you had them perfect. Rika hadn't told Kajii in so many words that she was attending Le Salon de Mayuko or that she'd had contact with Hitoko. She figured, though, that Kajii being Kajii, she would have already realized. A 5-kilogram turkey feeds about 10 adults, yes? That afternoon, Rika had had a lunch meeting at Balzac and caught a glimpse of the kitchen where Le Salon de Mayuko lessons had once been taught. As she looked over, a stout gray-haired man who she took to be the owner chef was tasting the sauce in a small pan that a young chef held out. The big commercial kitchen contained several huge sparkling clean ovens and drains in the floor. The idea that one person could cause such destruction in that impenetrable fortress was extraordinary. You can buy mini turkeys that would probably be suitable for 2 people, but then the defrosting and roasting times would be different. It would become a different meal, with a different recipe. You're someone who wanted to do things exactly as Madam had taught you. Even for someone with as healthy an appetite as yours, polishing off a turkey that feeds 10 people would be out of the question. Kajii showed no sign of upset at this, and Rika felt her confidence start to waver. Still, she went on. The reason you objected was because you understood immediately that even if you learned how to roast a turkey, you'd never have the opportunity to cook it. The other students at the lessons didn't make the recipes they'd learned because they had in their heads the idea of a someday when they'd get the chance to. If someday all their friends got together, they'd make that particular meal. But you didn't have that notion of a someday. That's been the case ever since you were a child. However optimistic you make yourself out to be, you can only believe in the things you see before you with your own eyes, the things you can get hold of this very instant. Rika stopped speaking and looked at Kajii. She realized that, in her eagerness for the words to hit home, she was adopting the tone Madam took when explaining things to the students. Whatever you did, however hard you tried, you couldn't have had 10 friends over to your house. You had plenty of worshippers, but you could hardly have the men you'd met on the dating sites together in the same place. Your maximum guest count would have been a man you were dating and your sister, which is to say, 2 people. Or maybe even that would have been impossible. Perhaps it would have been too risky to let someone you'd told all those lies meet a member of your family. Even if you were more serious about your cooking than any of the other students, you weren't blessed with a place where you could do it in the way you wanted to. Quite possibly, the same applied to every aspect of your life. Rika shot a look at Kajii. She looked as though she were smiling. Maybe, if you'd had enough ease and space in your life to believe in a someday, then everything would have been different. Believing in a someday isn't a sign of weakness or stupidity, and it isn't an escape either. When you realized that you didn't have anywhere you could cook and serve a turkey, you felt like you couldn't breathe, like you had nowhere left to go. You felt hatred towards all those students who weren't even thinking about their futures and wanted to leave the Balzac kitchen that very moment. When you realized that what you'd done meant you could no longer return to the one space where you felt safe, you grew sick and tired of everything. Am I right? Kajii smiled a wholesome smile without any hidden significance. Rika could understand very well what Chizu had said. This Manako was undoubtedly really sweet. Chizu told me that you've got a really sweet side to you and that you're a very talented cook. Is she the woman you were talking about that you thought you might have become friends with? Kajii eventually answered in a drawn-out, honeyed voice. What are you talking about? I don't know who that is. I've not even heard the name before. Even as she cocked her head, playing dumb, her voice was trembling slightly and her eyes were moist. Rika watched as she pursed her soft-looking lips. Their peach blush transformed to a bluish purple, and the skin on her face darkened. I've decided that I'm going to roast a turkey someday. Just for my own enjoyment. Rika decided to bring an end to her attack and try something new. I don't feel particularly sorry for you, you know. Not having any friends isn't especially unusual. I thought about whether, if I was to roast a turkey, I could invite 10 people over to eat it. I don't have a large circle of friends, and there isn't an oven big enough in the place I'm living at the moment. 10 people couldn't even fit inside my apartment, and I don't have enough chairs or tableware. So I couldn't do it. In fact, I feel like the people who can are in the minority. But if I can rent out a big room and get that number of people together, then maybe I'll give it a try. If you're free by then, if you're out of prison. Rika hesitated for a moment. An image of the apartment in front of the park that Hatoko had shown her rose up before her. Then I hope you'll come and have some of the turkey I'll cook. I'd love it if you came. Unable to control herself any longer, Kajii burst into tears. They weren't fake either. She sniffed, and her hands rose to her eyes, trying to keep back the tears that were spilling out. Through Kajii's fingers, Rika glimpsed her red bloodshot eyes, her swollen eyelids. The painful-sounding sobs kept on coming. If the acrylic screen hadn't been there, Rika would have handed her a handkerchief from her bag. Even playing out the hypothetical scenario, she felt embarrassed at the thought of her utilitarian hanky, which felt so mismatched with Kajii's style. She decided on her next day off that she'd pop into a department store and buy some handkerchiefs in a sophisticated floral pattern, of a kind that Kajii would like better.